And welcome to this episode of the Good Citizen Podcast. My honor today to have on as a return guest, Tim Goeglein. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me, Josh. Really appreciate it.
So, longtime listeners will remember Tim Goeglein is Vice President of External and Government Relations for Focus on the Family. And the big idea for our discussion today is how did we get here? How are we living in a society? How are we living in a culture where biblical marriage is looked at as strange or archaic or even harmful, where sexual ethics from Scripture are looked at as, again, weird, and we see abortion on the rise, those sorts of things. And Tim has written an amazing book that dives back into what happened in the 60s and 70s so that we can then chart a path forward. Now, before we jump in, just a little bit more information about Tim. He served as special assistant to President George W. Bush and as a deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. He was the president's principal outreach contact for conservative and faith-based groups. And then Tim's extensive resume, I won't go through all of it, but he served as a senior fellow at the Heritage Foundation, as a communications director for U.S. Senator Dan Coats and Gary Bauer. He's authored a number of books, including American Restoration, which we talked about last time, and he and his wife, Jenny, have two sons. In sum, Tim has been in D.C., he's been on the national stage for a while, and just brings a wealth of information to us. So looking forward to jumping into this interview. So Tim, first, anything about your background and current position that I might have missed?
No, and you're very gracious, in your introduction. 10 years in the U.S. Senate for Dan Coats of Indiana, and nearly 8 years at the White House for George W. Bush, and the last 16 as vice president of Focus on the Family here in Washington. Even though I'm a native Hoosier, when someone asks me, "Where are you from?" My first inclination, of course, and rightfully, is the center of the universe, Fort Wayne, Indiana. And I
Okay.
loved being back in Indiana recently to talk about the book where you and I refreshed our friendship. And I think it's important to say just one thing at the outset, which is that we really share a wonderful worldview, and I think that worldview can serve our state, our country, our culture more so now than ever. I think that we have arrived at a moment where people of goodwill, Josh, are increasingly saying, "What in the world is going on?"
Well, I appreciate your faithfulness. I was thinking about this some. The pastor of my home church, my father-in-law has been there for 19 years. They just celebrated 19 years at
Great.
church, and I was just reflecting as I had a chance to preach on Sunday that that's not all that common. And if that's true in the local church, it is certainly true in Washington D.C. So having been there
Yes, it
for
is.
16, if listeners can just imagine 16 years in Washington D.C., but no, we're so grateful that you are the voice. I appreciate your heart for ministry, certainly your intelligence and knowledge, but just that you're representing our shared biblical worldview there. Well, Tim, if you would
Thank
maybe
you.
jump in and share just a recent story, anything that recently has just blessed you in your work.
Well, I think the thing that is most, if I may say, a recurring blessing is the remarkable thing of living and working in Washington as I have for as long as I have. And yet, every single week, I meet another young Christian who is coming to the swamp, to understand that we're deployed. And it can
Mm.
sometimes feel as if we are, deployed behind the lines. But it is remarkable how faithful God is in sending young men and young women to the U.S. Senate, to the U.S. House, to the White House, to the executive cabinet agencies, to the Pentagon. I can honestly attest that in all the years I've been in Washington, I've never known of as many Bible studies, regular times for prayer
Mm.
going on in all three branches of our government. And I think that to me is a real grace note.
So, in speaking with pastors and friends around the country, I do get a sense that perhaps there is some form of reformation. Revival is a term that's thrown around a lot. I'm not sure that it's quite to that level, but just seeing a return to the Scripture, even in our local churches, we're certainly seeing that here in Indiana with Bible studies breaking out
Hmm.
everywhere. And so I'm very encouraged to hear that that's also true in DC. We'll pray that that continues. Well, Tim, you wrote a very helpful book probably a difficult book to write as I was reflecting on it, but it's titled Stumbling Towards Utopia. Could you help us understand what was the inspiration for writing that book?
Yeah, and thank you for asking, Josh. I travel about a third of the time for Focus on the Family. And I speak, debate, do panels, do remarks, you name it, in front of groups who are very commodious to our worldview and groups who, are totally opposed to us. And I really am, by God's grace, comfortable between and among, everybody. And one of the things that I have found in the last 3 years in travel is that after you do a debate or after you do a panel or after you speak or make remarks, and it comes to the proverbial Q&A part of your time together, people of goodwill almost always with pinpoint accuracy raise their hand and they say something like, how in the world did we get into this mess? And as I shared recently in Indianapolis when I was visiting there to a group of friends, there were chapters of American history where a speaker would have to say, "Tell me more of what you're asking about. Give me a further context." But I think in 21st century America, we know what is being asked. It is a incredibly uneven time in culture and in our civilization. We have the lowest marriage rates. We have the lowest fertility rates. We have a loneliness epidemic. We have a fentanyl epidemic. And we have a lot of other things that ultimately add up to what is overwhelmingly a massive spiritual crisis. And so, after 3 years or more, but at least 3 years of hearing this recurring question, Josh, I decided to answer that question. And I scratched out the outline for what became Stumbling Toward Utopia, which is a history of the moral and social revolution of the 1960s and 70s. I found in my wide reading and research that the reason we are in this mess is because of the moral and social radicalization of our country that was imposed upon the country really in the 1960s. And we are living with and dealing with the almost limitless numbers of social pathologies that have sought to replace a country, culture, and civilization where God was truly at the center of our founding and our prosperity as a nation through 2 world wars, a civil war, a Great Depression. And yet we come to the 60s and there is this massive revolt and rejection on the part of our elites against God and the very things that gave us greatness to begin with.
So I think all of us sense that change, the cultural change, but it's also so big, maybe so complex. It's hard to kind of get our arms around it or mind around it. In the book, you share some letters about a particular community in Northern California. I thought it was really powerful and just kind of underlining those changes. Would you share a little bit about that?
I'd be pleased to. I wanted to find a very personal way to animate the revolution that I'm, positing in the book. And so what I did is I published at the very start of the book pen pal letters from a friend who was born and raised in the Bay Area of near San Francisco in California. And you can see that in the letters I delineate letter by letter, year by year, this measurable decline in our country, culture, and civilization. The kind of pathologies that go from being a wholesome, connected community to a fractured and broken community. And of course, much of the social and moral revolution that is the reality of the 60s and 70s, ultimately culminating in the sexual revolution, the Great Society, many of the things that I'm writing about in this book, they really begin in a very personal way that were observed and felt incrementally by real families and real individuals in our country. And it's to the point now where people in 21st century America wake up each day And they say things like, I thought I recognized my country. I thought I better understood, what we are all about. And then you begin to internalize the fact that revolutions have consequences, not just out there theoretically for other people, but in the most important personal ways, in our churches, in our communities, in our schools, in our universities. And that really ultimately is what stumbling toward utopia is about. It's understanding in a very personal way what this revolution has meant for the greatest country in the history of mankind.
And that certainly hit me with the thought of you have kind of a mom and pop business slowly replaced by a marijuana dispensary, by a new age store. It's just very different than we were before. And so I think many of us feel that. So how can we trace this back? And you start with Woodrow Wilson, and certainly in the talk here in Indiana, I thought that was fascinating. Could you help us understand how Woodrow Wilson plays into this?
Well, Josh, what I found in my research is that all of the bad ideas that culminate in the 1960s and 70s, almost all of those bad ideas really begin to take root. The seeds are planted at the turn of the 20th century. In politics, with President Woodrow Wilson, the first major progressive president, this is a man who really disliked the Constitution. He was uncomfortable with the Declaration of Independence. He felt that our country really would be better served if it were run by experts instead of kind of citizen sovereignty that our founding fathers and mothers envisioned, and really is the greatness of America. Woodrow Wilson wanted to change politics. He was uncomfortable with the three branches of government, uncomfortable with checks and balances. He really saw himself as wanting to be an American equivalent of a British prime minister. And that was really what he sought to do. And frankly, he was very successful. He cut a new path and created the way for a kind of super president, which is not at all what our founders intended. And he changed politics by doing it. Also, in the same space is the founder of the ACLU, Roger Baldwin, a very committed communist. He wanted to change the American law and legal system, very uncomfortable with the prominent role of faith and religion. And of course, he succeeded beyond his wild imagination in the upending of the American judicial system. I talk about Margaret Sanger. She was a committed eugenicist, a racialist, um, very uncomfortable with large families, particularly among legal immigrants. She was uncomfortable with faith, and she sought to champion abortion long before so called legal abortion was imposed upon our country in the 1970s. And of course, John Dewey. A man incredibly uncomfortable with a traditional form of the purpose of education, character formation, the creation of great citizens, objective standards of right and wrong, truth and fiction. He really wanted to create the new citizen, and he thought by creating the new citizen, the new purpose for education, he could transform the country. And John Dewey, like Margaret Sanger, like Roger Baldwin, like Woodrow Wilson, as I outlined in Stumbling Toward Utopia, they planted these seeds and they germinated in the 60s and 70s with the revolution that they had wrought.
So this is helpful because often in these conversations, especially most recently about the what feels like a very sudden rise of transgender ideology. How did we get to the point where a man declares that he is a woman trapped in a man's body? This would have, as Carl Truman has premised, like this would have been unintelligible to most generations of humans, and yet it feels like it happened so fast. However, it is more than 100 years in the making, and I think we have to keep that in mind as we work to restore. Sometimes we're laying foundations that may take time to work itself out. So we've talked there about abortion, about law, about the presidency itself, about education, but certainly in sexual mores. I know you have Nietzsche, and then certainly here in Indiana, we think a lot about Alfred Kinsey. So how did these individuals impact sexual mores in the United States?
May I say, of all of the things of stumbling toward utopia, I think this is the most important part of the book. Because when you understand Marxism, you understand it ultimately as trying to project a new view of economics. But what Marxism really is, it's this belief in the perfectibility of man. It's in social engineering. What Marxism is about ultimately is changing human nature. And we all know that human nature is a constant. There was only one perfect man, Jesus Christ, and social engineering by the part of woke elites or government, or take your pick, they will always fail. That's why I call the book Stumbling Toward Utopia. Sir Thomas More wrote a famous book on utopia, which means nowhere. It's hollow, and that's progressivism. And so Marxism, in its blind quest to change human nature, ultimately ends up doing terrible damage. And I think we can all now say, as a great writer in the Wall Street Journal recently observed, that we've all been living through this period of time of the emperor with no clothes. We all knew that what the emperor and what the emperor class, our elite progressive overlords, have been in trying to impose in our country is completely false. We know what a woman is. We know what a man is. We've all watched, frankly, in horror, as a Supreme Court justice is asked, "What is a woman?" and says with a straight face that she can't answer that question. Of course, she can answer that question. So the sexual revolution ultimately puts normal people in a position of having to lie, of having to be in the public square, but not to observe what everybody knows is that the emperor has no clothes. And I think that we've arrived at a moment, and I underscore this in Stumbling Towards Utopia, where millions of Americans are revisiting the principal things, the what I call the permanent things, and they are realizing that we no longer have to step into the public square, especially as men and women of faith, and kind of go along to get along by continuing this myth of no clothes. We now know overwhelmingly that this kind of debate in the sexual revolution only hurts people. It doesn't help them.
So, thinking recently of Chesterton and how he would sometimes describe it as an enchanted or disenchanted world. And
Yes.
I'm one of the issues that came up this morning in a conversation with some legislators as we're here for Organization Day. The formal launch of the session here is mental health, especially among young people. And when you remove all of the meaning and you say, well, you just live in this disenchant, and I love that definition of utopia. I hope listeners caught that it means it's hollow. And perhaps what better description of what we're facing
Right.
today than is just a
Yes.
hollow, meaningless. There is no God. There is no morality. So I think that's just a
Well,
brilliant way
and
to
Josh,
describe it. Yeah,
I'm interrupting you only because this is a
please.
great conversation, but I want to inject something right into that point, if I may, very briefly, so forgive me. My friend Robbie George at Princeton wrote a very important book. It's a gem of a book. It's small, easily gettable, easily readable. And it's called Conscience and Its Enemies. I think that that's a very, very pugnacious title. But the subtitle is exactly what you're speaking about. And it is the confrontation, of confronting the dogmas of liberal secularism. What we are witnessing in a great country like ours is for conscience purposes, when faith and religion is artificially removed from the human experience, you get hollowness. Um, there is nothing unconstitutional about faith and religion in the public square. We need it in government. We need it in education. We need it in entertainment. We need it in the Fortune 500. It's not a form of bad manners. The spiritual reality of men and women is that faith is nurturing and it's nourishing. And it's the sort of thing that gives equilibrium and gravitas to a great nation and to a great state.
I appreciate you pointing that out. And there's been some talk of joy as of late, the United States and lacking joy. But
Yes,
I do believe that the spirit of the Lord of having a faith in Christ, that even in at times when politics doesn't go our way or court cases don't go our way, that we still bring that to bear. We bring a vision of whole life flourishing according to God's good design. And
yes.
sometimes Christians are marked as being stodgy or repressive, and actually it's no. We want you to flourish according to the way God created you. So
Mhm.
that inspires me each day to get up and get out there. So I appreciate that part of the book. Now, one of the most sobering parts of the book for me was the comment on the family, and then a few statistics that you shared when you were here. Now, we recently had on the podcast, not released just yet, but an individual that does fatherless ministry, and some of the
Yes.
stats there of over 80% of juveniles that are in incarceration grew up in a fatherless home. Like, these are just stunning facts. So would you share a little bit about how the 60s brought about the further breakdown of the family and kind of where we are today?
Yeah, it's important, isn't it, not to ever get lost in a blizzard of data. But it's important at the same time to be able to share our views that are confirmed in social science. For instance, I was reading an analysis this morning in the 5 boroughs that comprise New York City that one of every 8 school age child does not have a permanent home. I mean,
Wow.
wow! In the cultural capital of our country, what I shared, Josh, is the following, and I think this is important that we internalize. In 1960, 73% of all children birth to 18 lived in a home with a married mother and father. That
Mhm.
number by 1980 had dropped to just above half. And by 2015, that number was hovering around 40%. That is stunning. We have a fatherlessness crisis in our country. I would call it a plague of fatherlessness. Father absence and the impact on a young person is incalculable. It impacts that person for the rest of his or her life. And the reality is that government cannot save a marriage. Government cannot tuck a child into bed at night. But the reality, as I show in Stumbling Towards Utopia, is that government can make it a whole lot worse.
When that when you look at root issues, root problems, sometimes we talk about we don't want to put a band-aid on a broken arm. This is one of those issues that is just
Yes.
striking. It's the breakdown of the family, and as biblical Christians, this is one of the key institutions created by God, and no wonder if it is undermined and destroyed, that the society is going to go that way. And certainly, we've dealt with the issue of parental rights here in Indiana. We're going to be dealing with that around the country, I believe. And to make it worse, when government thinks it can come in and parent better than fit parents, this
Mm.
is where we have to draw the line and say no.
You know,
We've already got
yeah,
the epidemic. So
yes, I want to pick up on that because, as you know, Stumbling Toward Utopia has a huge section on part of the catalyzing a reason that we are in this mess. And I think it's very important for everybody to really understand that we didn't just evolve in this direction. In 1964, President Lyndon Baines Johnson went to the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and he formally launched what he called the Great Society. This was an echo of 2 of his heroes, Franklin Roosevelt, who had launched the New Deal, and Woodrow Wilson. And Lyndon Johnson was a progressive on these matters to the core. And Josh, what he promises in that speech is really colossal and breathtaking. He says the government is going to solve poverty, that government is going to solve racial issues, that government is going to get involved in family issues, that government is going to resolve our education issues. And most Americans in 1964, which was the last year of the baby boom, most Americans never thought of the federal government as the solver of poverty, the solver of racial issues, the solver of education issues. But that is precisely what the Great Society set out to do. And it didn't take long. I mean, relatively shortly after the Great Society was implemented, important social scientists, both on the left and the right, said things like, this isn't working. You're spending billions and eventually trillions of dollars. And all of those data points that you promised, we're going backwards. We're not going forward. Poverty is worse. Marriage rates are lower. Fertility rates are lower. Fatherlessness has increased. This formula isn't working. But progressives, as I said earlier, by and large are social engineers. So they just keep going on a track that clearly cannot succeed.
There's a ministry leader here in Indianapolis, leads a great ministry on the east side, and he often recounts the story of a picture in Appalachia of I think it's a father and then a son sitting on a porch, and the government agents are there. They're promising the world, and then fast forward to today, it's now him sitting on the porch, and nothing's changed, and it's just
Right,
this kind of living
exactly.
embodiment. And if
Yes,
memory serves, you used the figure something like $22 trillion have been spent on alleviating
yes.
poverty, and here we are. So
Yeah,
again,
I'm glad you mentioned that. The Heritage Foundation, and we at Focus on the Family work very closely with the Heritage Foundation. Their most recent numbers on the so-called war on poverty, I believe, is 2022 or 2023. And as of then, of course, it's more now. But as of then, which is I think 2 years ago, our nation had spent $22 trillion battling poverty, and those rates are higher than they were when the war on poverty was launched by Lyndon Johnson. So you would think logically, rationally, that people of goodwill would say, let's stop doing what's not working. They say that when you're in a hole, you stop digging. But unfortunately, the busy as a beaver bureaucrats keep digging. But all that to say, and I think this is so important, Josh, very important, despite all of what we've discussed, I remain an inveterate optimist. And I actually believe the best days for the United States of America are ahead of us. I think we're going to see marriage rates increase. I think we're going to see fertility rates increase because I believe that we have hit a moment, maybe a nadir, where people of goodwill are saying of a sudden, wait a minute, the natural nuclear family is a really good thing. Being married is a really good thing. Investing your lives in your community and in your church and in your local schools is a good thing. School choice is a good thing. Charter schools is a good thing. Homeschooling is a good thing. Allowing boys to play in girls' sports or men to play in women's sports is a bad thing. And I think that capstone moment in the Olympics, where a woman was boxed in the face by a man who said he was a woman, I think in many ways that clarified what had otherwise been an academic debate. So ideas have consequences. And the good news is that good ideas have good consequences. And I think there are people who want something better. And I think that we're America. We have the ability to have an American restoration.
that's really encouraging to hear. I was chuckling a little bit yesterday at a news story in one of the major outlets about the term is trad wives and how they're trending and they're popular. So this idea,
Yeah,
this is their view of family, as one of many options is that man, woman have children, and it's so I was just chuckling about the fact that they're being successful. They seem to be happy, and everyone's looking at them like, what do you have that we don't? And so this
right.
is encouraging to me, and I think to all of our listeners, just to be confident that what Scripture says is both true and good. Let's get out and say, hey, here's what's best for our community, for our society. So I wanted to pivot a little bit here into what just happened, and I'll go ahead and let the listeners know that Tim actually made a prediction before the election that President Trump had a good shot at winning it. In fact, if things fell correctly, he might even run away. And of course, at that moment, and all of us, it's recent enough to remember, like there was a lot of uncertainty. And so it just proved once again to me that you've been in this a long time and have a way of kind of reading the tea leaves there. And so as I've thought through this, it's not so much a solution, President Trump being a president and pushing back against some of these ideas that we've discussed at length today. It's not so much a solution as, to me, an opportunity, I think, for
Hmm.
Christians to step in and make a difference. But would you share with us just a few of the challenges that you might see or some of the opportunities that you see with the Trump presidency?
Well, first, I think that we would do well as conservatives to understand that euphoria is a real, identifiable human emotion. And after your team has won the Super Bowl or the Rose Bowl, right? You have this view that maybe you can never be defeated again. That football or whatever your team or individual sports figure is. I'm just using the athletic metaphor. That when you're in the moment, it's just that there's never been a greater team in the history of mankind. And I am an optimist by nature, period. But what I'm suggesting is that in the midst of euphoria, we as conservatives have to negate that temptation toward our progressive friends. That somehow now we're on an upward trajectory that can never end, and we can engineer ourselves to, kind of the new and better world. And we learned in the novel Brave New World, and in many of C.S. Lewis's beautiful, powerful novels that we ought to be careful. And what I mean by this, Josh, is that politicians, by and large, people even of the best will possible, that on the large questions that we're talking about, by and large, cannot bring to us resolution. The political class is very good at making things worse, but it's only incremental often in making things better. And by the way, good public policy decisions do help create, better ways forward. But what I'm suggesting to you, and what Stumbling Toward Utopia attempts to do, is that we ought to resist, the new versions of a great society. It's better not to favor a top-down solution to most of anything, but rather to look organically at where we can do the most good. Where is that? In our neighborhoods, in our churches, in our parishes, in our schools. We don't want Silicon Valley. We don't want Wall Street. We don't want Washington, with the sort of top-down solutions for the spiritual things that are roiling our nation. And I think it's very important, even in this remarkable political season, and it is historic, right? I think it's very good that we are more temperate about what is possible.
I appreciate that because I have one fear, and that is, or concern, is that Christians will look at this and just, well, he President Trump is there. He's putting some folks in that are going to better promote biblical principles. Therefore, I can relax. And my encouragement is, no, this I think is an opportunity to promote what you've just described, more federalism. How can the state of Indiana better govern itself and support our
Yes,
local communities? And
yes.
so I see it as an opportunity there and an encouragement to folks not to just let your guard down and kind of go back and hope that all of these trends that we've been discussing all day today, just by electing someone to the White House, is going to change that. And in fact, the administration may be an example of how some of those ideas have impacted the right as well
Mhm.
as it has impacted the left. But I'm encouraged by that focus on neighborhoods. And as we come to a close, just any thoughts for listeners about how can they, in their own life, in their own family and church community, how can they help reverse the effects of this?
Well, what I describe in Stumbling Toward Utopia is an attempt to dismantle America. And I believe that we now need to dismantle the terrible legacy of the '60s and the '70s. And by the way, I think there were many wonderful things that came to us in that period of time, and I talk about them. Advances in civil rights, the computer age. I certainly grant that in that period of time, important things, happened in our nation, and I champion them and am for them. But what I'm saying is that we need to dismantle this progressive, hollow view of the perfectibility of man. And I think what we need to do, and this is the most important thing after praying for our nation, is we need to engage as never before. I cannot tell you, Josh, how many times I've spoken to fellow conservatives, and given all the things that we've talked about in this really wonderful dialogue, the first inclination for many people who are feeling discouragement and despair has been to disengage, to keep your head down and to stand, away. And I think we can never, ever allow ourselves as Christians and conservatives to become apathetic about the most important things. So my view, strongly held, is with grace and magnanimity and goodwill, but unapologetically, we need to engage as never before. We need to run for the school boards, run for the local city and county councils. We need to train up a new generation of young people to take their position of leadership in government, in law, in entertainment, in journalism. We need to be intentional. We want our children, in one sense, to be countercultural, but we also want them to be transformative. And so I think it's an idea of self-possession and proactively being smart about the way we are shaping the next generation of young Americans. And the really good news is that God very often works through a remnant of like-minded people. Sometimes we may be in the majority, and oftentimes we may not be. But the important thing is that our principles are timeless and they always work. And so I think we can be confident in those periods of time, whether we're feeling that we're part of the popular crowd or the unpopular crowd, that as long as we are committed to due north and engaging, I think very good days will be ahead. And I'm quite confident that we're going to see a number of public policy and cultural victories in the not so distant future.
Tim, thank you for your example of this. As you mentioned, being self assured about your faith, but then being an engaged Christian citizen. I just so appreciate your example. So, listeners, please go pick up a copy of Stumbling Towards Utopia. We've just kind of scratched the surface of this book. I really encourage you to study what's happened so we can look forward, as well as Tim's other books. And so, we'll have some links there in the show notes. Tim, thank you for being with us today.
Such a blessing and joy, Josh. Be of good cheer, and thank you so much.